Everyone laughed at the black man in the luxury store, until the CEO stepped out and called him Sir. For a breathless minute, the boutique seemed to hold its applause like a secret. High ceilings echoed little more than the click of heels and the faint pop of a cork from a corner tray. Sunlight slanted across the marble like a spotlight. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured gold on racks of leather and silk. A woman toward the front, sharp cardigan, sharper tongue, had a finger pointed so close to a man's chest that the two were almost a punctuation mark. Around them, phones lifted like a field of delicate satellites. Casters hummed on polished tile. A small boy made a sound and then hushed again because adults were watching. The woman, Christina Hayes, was a manager at Meridian's flagship store. She carried authority the way some people carried their wallets, practical, rehearsed, ready to be opened and used. Her badge read, Manager, in a strip of tasteful silver. Her shoes clicked with a rhythm that suggested she had been running this aisle in her head for years. There was a code she lived by, one she called, Protect the Floor. It was shorthand for 100 internal memos that, in her reading, always began with suspicion when a customer didn't match the expected script of their face and an assumed spending pattern. She believed, without dramatic thought, that she was enforcing order. The man she accused stood still as a statue polished by patience. He was not a caricature of wealth, nor an advertisement of success. He did not shout or brandish credentials. He had arrived in a quiet, impeccably cleaned Bentley and wore a suit that suggested restraint rather than flash. His hands were folded, fingers unadorned beyond one modest watch. He carried a Centurion card in his wallet, an invitation-only black card that, to anyone who knew such things, spoke plainly of belonging. Yet none of those signals mattered to Christina in that moment. He was Damon Wells. He had spent a lifetime learning how the world sized him up before he spoke. He had learned how to carry a presence that did not demand agreement, but that made unreasonable assumptions difficult to sustain. Dignity was his first language. He used it now. He had been coming to Meridian since long before Christina had been made manager. He knew the store's inventory like an old friend, knew the names of the craftsmen behind some of the handbags, could tell the difference between a seasonal stock and a collector's piece by the weight of the stitching. He had a right to be there that no one in that boutique could credibly deny. Christina did not see him. She saw a headline her fears wanted to write. "Get out," she snapped, each syllable clipped and precise. "You don't belong here." Her voice was small in the space, but her accusation landed like a stone in glass. At her command, Miguel Torres, security, broad and careful, took a step forward with the reflex of someone who had been trained to make public situations disappear. Miguel's badge glinted under the chandelier. He had worked Meridian for 6 years and had long ago learned the choreography of these interruptions. Diffuse, escort, apologize, move on. Yet when he looked at Damon, he saw the quiet steadiness of a man who belonged. Miguel's hand paused at his radio. "Sir, you need to leave," Christina said, turning to the crowd as if to call for a judge. She jabbed at Damon's chest with a finger that vibrated with belief. The finger left a momentary heat on fabric and then nothing. The gesture, though, registered as violence in the small, charged room. Phones thrust forward and live lines began to thread through the air. People who had gone about their shopping lives with polite curiosity became immediate witnesses. The child who had stifled his cry felt it again. An elderly shopper's breath hitched. Some patrons smiled, some scowled, and a few shifted uncomfortably, aware of how quickly the performance of civility could slide into spectacle. "Do you have a receipt?" Christina demanded, the demand thin as a blade. She had an internal checklist in her head designed to justify action. Odd behavior, lack of bag, lack of proof, eyes that didn't belong to the expected taxonomy of clientele. It was a protocol people like her recited into their dinners as if it were scripture. Damon put his hand to his pocket, and the room noticed the movement as if it were part of a careful reveal. He fished out his wallet, and without anger, produced his American Express Centurion card, along with a small embossed invitation to Meridian's private preview, an old printed card that to anyone paying attention would have ended the scene. But rituals of suspicion are not undone by paper. The card lay between them like a frail truce. "That's not necessary," Damon said, voice even. He called her ma'am once with a softness that did not invite an argument. He did not raise his voice. He did not plead. He simply named the world he had inhabited and expected to be known for what it was. Sarah Kim, a young sales associate with a name badge that read associate and a nervous smile, stepped forward. She had watched Christina escalate enough times to know the pattern. She saw the card and the card holder, and the damage about to be done. "This is Mr. Wells," she said, her voice cracking with more fear than courage. "He's been here before. He's—" Christina cut her off. "You're not involved," she said, cold. "Step back or you're off the floor." There was an economy to her cruelty. It didn't waste breath on explanation. Sarah's face went white and then red, the rush of a heartbeat visible under her skin. She wasn't yet old enough to bear the world without a bruise. She heard the words that would cost her a job, felt the scope of them like an unpaid balance on a credit line. Still, she did not retreat from the truth. "He didn't do anything," she said. "You're wrong." When a manager fires someone to shore up a narrative in front of customers, it is not only an employment action, it is a threat performed in public. Sarah's dismissal was not a private memo clicked into HR. It was a bell pulled in the middle of the shop. Christina moved with the assurance of someone who had done this and then convinced herself she had found the moral high ground. "You're suspended," she said. "Step away from the customer. Now." Miguel's shoulders tightened. He had been there the night before when the store's loss prevention flagged a group of teenagers running contraband, an incident that had nothing to do with Damon. He had also seen enough smaller indignities. Black customers followed in trial runs. Families watched for hours. He had started to catalog the small injustices like a gardener cataloging weeds. "Let's not make this worse," Miguel said quietly. He measured the room and the obligation placed on his uniform. He knew what "get out" could become if pushed: an arrest, a viral clip, a legal mess. He also knew what it meant to refuse to escalate. Christina scoffed, the sound cutting through the air. "Do your job," she said into her radio, and someone at the back of the store whispered that she had called for additional security. The word had barely left her mouth when a small, relentless green notification began to ripple through a phone screen on the periphery of the crowd. Outside, in a narrow cafe that faced the Meridian entrance, Tiffany Washington had been idly scrolling for hours between classes she taught and the TikToks she liked to make. Tiffany worked in short bursts, capturing odd city moments with a camera voice that was part humor, part righteous curiosity. When she saw the woman on the sidewalk point toward the boutique, and then the man who did not move, Tiffany sensed a story worth telling. She opened her app, tapped the live button, and walked toward the store with her phone held steady. She stepped onto the sidewalk and trained her camera through the glass. The live comments poured in like a tide. Within moments, the little green number at the top of the screen skimmed into the hundreds. Inside, Mrs. Eleanor Davidson, an elderly woman whose morning had been a good walk and a stop for a bespoke scarf, reached instinctively for her small digital recorder. She was a federal judge who had seen human theater in courtrooms that demanded the same moral clarity Meridian now needed. She had a neat cane, sensible shoes, and an attention that rarely erred. When she recorded, she did so without performative indignation. She recorded because she believed the facts mattered. On Tiffany's stream, someone typed, "Is that security?" Others wrote, "He looks like he owns the place." The comment feed scrolled like a nervous heartbeat. The numbers climbed, 300, 500, 1,000. People shared the link with captions that matched an instinct: "This is wrong." The city outside the boutique bent toward that small screen. Inside, the room heated. A woman with a Chanel bag pushed to the side, not to hide but to get a better view. A man in a suit glanced at his watch, then at the entrance, then at Damon's steady profile. A camera in the store dropped briefly to capture a timestamp in the corner of the security feed. 3:14 p.m. A small mechanical witness. Damon, who had the soft steadiness of someone trained to treat indignity as an event rather than an identity, did not pull out his phone. He did not try to shame Christina or to make a spectacle of reparations. He put his wallet back gently and said, "I came here to look at the leather Samsonite. I have been a customer for years. Christina's lips curled, part disbelief, part triumph. Her worldview demanded a villain, and she had found one. We have a protocol, she said, reciting the rule as if it were a lock she had to reset against the world. If you can't produce proof, we have to escort you out. Around them, the air felt tight as an instrument string. People who had been browsing began to speak in low, sharp voices. Some murmured support for Damon's calm. Others nodded at Christina, as if she were a necessary steward of order. Sarah stood a step away, defiance in her jaw, her jacket slipping from shoulders bruised by the moment. Mrs. Davidson's recorder hummed in her palm. The judge's voice was calm when she said, barely above the hum of the room, "This man is being humiliated. I am recording." That single, quiet pronouncement changed the tenor of the fight. A federal judge's attention was not the attention of a curious bystander. It required evidence. It recognized the law's presence even in retail spaces. The fact of her being there introduced a new strand into the room. The reality that someone's career, someone's reputation, could be tested by the footage now spreading through the air. "You can step outside and we can talk," Christina offered, thinking in the rules of her training. Her eyes flicked to the security desk where a monitor showed the frontal camera, to the sign that read, "Meridian, established 1972, a family business given the iconic certainty of a plaque." In that moment, she was defending not only the store's protocols, but the narrative of Meridian as a sanctuary of the proper kind of customer. Damon looked at Miguel and then at Christina. He measured the path ahead. To escalate would be to give her the spectacle she wanted. To leave without contest would be to allow the humiliation to stand as a precedent. "I will not leave because I showed what I had," he said, voice even. And then he turned to the circle of phones and said, without accusation, and with a calm that was itself a kind of accusation, "If anyone here is recording, please do." Phones lifted higher. Tiffany's broadcast pulsed as comments asked for a closer view. The moment opened like a wound, and then sealed with a chant of small truths. "I own this suit," someone wrote. "He belongs here," typed another. Mrs. Davidson kept recording. Christina's face hardened. "Security, escort him out," she ordered. The word escort had a neat bureaucratic cruelty to it, an effort to make the act administrative so that moral attention would move on. Miguel, trained and usually obedient, moved differently than she expected. He stepped between Christina and Damon and kept his hand open, palm visible. "We don't have to escalate it," he said, to her and to the phones. "Sir, ma'am, let's step back and do this properly." Damon inclined his head in thanks. He did not demand apologies. He did not demand compensation. He only asked the world to be what it claimed to be, a place where evidence mattered. In the lobby at that moment, a camera phone angle just so captured Christina's finger at Damon's chest, and the exact millisecond when she said, "We're going to review our footage and files. If a customer can't show proof, we proceed." Which by the room's light translated cruelly into, "You can be treated as less." Tiffany's live stream, rough, breathy, urgent, caught the exact cadence. Her viewers doubled. Comments shifted from shock to fury to instruction. Save, share, call them out. The clip spread to a private group chat, then to a larger feed, then to a local community account that syndicates clips of injustice. Outside the store, the city adjusted around the new orbit. Coffee shops filled with faces watching the same frame. A local anchor, mid-broadcast, paused when an intern shoved a tablet toward the desk. A morning show producer texted a clip into a group with the subject line, "This is trending." The video, raw and unedited, circulated. Damon stood with the patience of someone who had learned to make time his ally. He watched the room. He watched Sarah, jaw clenched, her uniform badge trembling. He watched Miguel, whose fingers tapped a rhythm on the edge of the counter. He watched Mrs. Davidson, who kept her recorder level and steady. He watched Tiffany's live feed comments scroll like an incantation. The presence of witnesses, their faces bent and bright with attention, changed everything. Witnesses can take an event and make it evidence. At one point, a man in the back muttered, "This is theater," as if spectacle undermined truth. Christina smiled at the thought as if to say she had no interest in theater. She was protecting a standard. But the standard depended on the subjective reading of threat, and the virtue of that reading was now in dispute because the world was watching. When the gallery of phones had multiplied enough to feel like a small arena, someone in the crowd, an inelegant move but one that would be crucial, began to upload the footage to an external cloud. The file was small, but it was a seed. It would travel quickly. That seed found its way into a local activist channel within minutes. A senior salesperson who had been polishing a display stopped and said, "We can show loyalty card history, shipping receipts, our VIP registry." She was attempting to do what protocol should have done before Christina's finger had struck the air: apply information to prevent harm. But the moment had already unraveled into performance. Information after an insult is an insufficient balm. Social media does not wait for institutions to act. It migrates toward scandal and then toward resolution. Within an hour, the clip collected not just indignation, but commentary from people who had seen similar things. A parent followed in a department store. A college student stopped at a boutique dressing room. A wedding party watched with suspicion. These anecdotes fed the clip like oxygen. The story was no longer only about what had happened in Meridian's flagship. It felt to many like an emblem of a pattern. Damon did something most people would not. He asked quietly for a manager's log, and then spoke into his phone, not for show, but for record. "I am going to call the corporate office," he said, the statement modest in the way of those who live inside institutions and know how to make them answer. He gave his name and his expectation for a response that would be more than the mock diplomacy of a generic customer complaint. That call would be, in fact, the first thread that tugged at the next knot. Meridian's central office received the clip, forwarded it quickly to a regional director, and then, because the clip's engagement numbers were climbing, an internal alert pinged at headquarters. The alert came with a thumbnail, a manager pointing, a man standing patient, an elderly judge recording. The clip's caption, crafted by an algorithm, read, "Customer humiliated in flagship store." Back in the boutique, Christina's lips moved in a syllable of triumph that she misinterpreted as righteousness. She believed she had done her job: deter risk, safeguard inventory, maintain a curated clientele. She could not see in that narrow moral universe how the same mechanisms that protected property could become instruments for exclusion. Outside, Tiffany's stream counted viewers, numbers that no human could watch in full, but that suggested a public appetite for bearing witness. The clip's shape changed as it moved from platform to platform, cropped, slowed, replayed at full speed to highlight Christina's finger, with captions added that suggested other layers of meaning. The title changed from suspicion to accusation as the social imagination filled in the blanks. A producer at a nearby local news station placed a call to Meridian's public relations address because this was no longer a neighborhood scuffle. It had the shape of corporate risk. The PR inbox, which had been accustomed to questions about new collections and holiday hours, received instead a quiet, urgent subject line: "Flagship incident. Immediate response requested." At corporate, the chain of custody followed a familiar and impersonal path. A junior PR person forwarded the clip to legal. Legal forwarded to HR. HR pinged a senior executive for guidance. The clip's momentum created pressure from the outside. A cascade of social commentary, a trending hashtag beginning to form, and pressure from within as staffers scanned a library of personnel records for any pattern that might explain the moment. For the moment, however, all that was only potential. The boutique remained a small island of consequence. The people inside were now bound together by the event in a way that rewired the afternoon. Sarah stood stunned, her uniform hanging slightly awkward, as if it had always been a costume she had not rehearsed. Miguel kept his palm out, a small bargaining tool against escalation. Mrs. Davidson kept recording like a slow, methodical witness. Damon watched those around him with an absence of triumph. He was not interested in punishment for punishment's sake. He had learned the dangers of spectacle. He had seen how quick vindication could be swallowed by the corporate appetite for quiet settlements and non-disclosure. He wanted accountability that changed structures. He wanted the store to implement practices that did not ask a black man in a suit to prove his right to be present. He wanted an honest conversation to ripple up the chain. He closed his wallet, slow and deliberate. He turned his gaze to the store's security camera, and with the same calm in his tone that had carried him so far, said, "Please, keep that footage. We will need it." Phones hummed like a delayed storm. Outside, the stream continued. The comments included both solidarity and the inevitable clickbait noise. But buried in the steady line of reaction was a steady demand. What does the company do? People were beginning to ask not only who was at fault, but what the company that employed Christina would choose to do about it. It was the question corporate could not ignore. An hour after the incident began, the Meridian PR inbox pinged again, this time with additional weight. A social influencer with a substantial following had reposted the clip with the caption, "This is 2024. This is unacceptable." The repost reached subsets of communities Meridian's brand people watched for both risk and opportunity. Numbers climbed, shares, reshares, comments. The clip had entered an ecosystem that turned indignation into leverage. At the edge of those numbers, James Richardson saw an email subject line when he was checking his phone 15 minutes into an afternoon meeting. He was the company's chief executive. Neat hair, practiced restraint, the kind of man who measured words before letting them go. The subject line read, "Urgent, flagship incident." A thumbnail supplied context. He could have sketched a dozen possible scenarios from what he saw. Executives see hazards before others see them. But this frame of a manager pointing at a customer while phones recorded something raw and ugly was not an ambiguity James wanted to leave to algorithms. He glanced, then tapped the clip. He watched a manager accuse a customer, a security guard hesitate, a sales associate intercede and be dismissed, a federal judge quietly record. The clip was only a minute long, but it had the density of an accusation dressed in quiet footage. The algorithm's share rate shot up while James sat there, not composing a press release, but measuring moral imperative. He thought about the brand, yes, about the stock, about investor calls. But he thought more sharply about what a company becomes when it looks the other way. At the boutique, the room had gone quiet in a way that felt like a held breath. Christina's hand trembled, not from fear of consequence, but because she had staked her identity on a code that the world now questioned. She looked around and found herself not on the same side as many of the people who had once supported her. For the first time, she felt exposed. Damon, his voice deliberate, said, "I will expect a formal review. Please have your HR notify me who is handling this." There is a quality to certain decisions, small, administrative, easily executed, that later becomes part of history. Damon could have simply left the store and let the clip do the work of memory. He didn't. He called the corporate number on a small card he had been given at a private event years ago. He asked for James Richardson by name. The call pinged through corporate layers the way a stone sends ripples through a pond. The person who took the call did not know they were handling a thread that would soon become taut enough to cut. James listened for a long moment, the video still playing in his ear. He asked for context, measured what he heard, and then asked for the security feed. Someone in the room forwarded the higher resolution file. The footage was so clear that it seemed to make a moral case by the clarity of its pixels. A pointing finger, a patient man, a dismissed employee. James, who had grown up around the family business that Meridian had become, felt the shape of the moment. He made a decision that would be the hinge of what came next. He would go. He did not yet know what he would do when he arrived. He did not yet know if he would call the manager by name or make the moment a public rebuke. But the clip had called him in. Companies at their best answer the things they fear and correct them. At their worst, they look away. James' first act was one of movement. A phone call, a quick sentence into someone's ear, then the hollow, efficient sound of an office making space. Back in the store, something thicker than heat hung in the air, the weight of an event that had outgrown the room. People who had come for shopping stayed a little longer, as if to see how this specific story would resolve the general pattern they saw reflected in it. Sarah, watching the crowd, realized she had been punished for insisting on a human being's dignity. Miguel understood that he had been asked to choose between protocol and conscience and had chosen the latter. Mrs. Davidson kept recording, unconcerned for applause but conscious of the gravity of documentation. Tiffany, outside, watched viewers flood her comments with messages she did not anticipate. Her hands shook a little as the count climbed. She watched as the clip was reposted, slowed down in some versions to highlight Christina's finger, converted to an image with a caption that read, "Watch this." She had no goal beyond bearing witness, but she understood, curiously, the power of the pebble she had thrown into the pond. By the time James's assistant pinged the store to say someone from corporate was on the way, the boutique had moved from a private insult to a public problem. The transformation of a personal humiliation into an institutional moment had happened so quickly that some people never quite had the chance to name what had occurred. To them, it had always been a private inconvenience. To others, it was proof of a pattern. To Meridian's leadership, it was now a reputational risk that required attention. Still, nothing had been said publicly. No postings from the company had gone up. No statements had been rehearsed. The clip kept circulating with the rawness of the moment intact. People took sides. A few posted comments defending Christina because they believed she was protecting property. Many more posted outrage because they believed she had protected a protocol that discriminated. Damon did not posture for the cameras. He answered questions simply when asked. He asked that the incident be reviewed thoroughly and that the entire organization look at how policy could become prejudice. He did not demand that Christina be fired. He demanded that the company look at the mechanisms that allowed a manager to weaponize a rule. He wanted remedies that would prevent future harm, not simply a public shaming that might satisfy attention, but do nothing to change procedures. Those were not fashionable demands in a viral moment, where the currency often was quick retribution and the comfort of instant moral sorting. But Damon had the patience of long-term strategy. He wanted structural remedies, training, transparent appeals, a hotline that did not funnel complaints into the same people accused of bias. He wanted the company to be able to say, honestly, that it had changed in measurable ways. As the corporate SUV motors warmed up in the lot outside headquarters, men and women in pressed shirts aligning their schedules and their talking points, inside the boutique, people began to murmur predictions. Some thought the company would issue a carefully worded statement within the hour, apologizing in the manner that defers consequence. Others thought Meridian would wait for the heat to pass. The world, though, was already choosing its reaction. The clip's algorithmic life made patience a precarious virtue. When the first camera truck rolled into sight down the avenue, someone in a line of customers outside the store said, "They're here." The truck's logo was plain, but it carried a crew ready to scan for faces. Reporters began to gather like birds at a feeder. The city's attention works in little increments like that. Inside the boutique, the air felt as if it were compressing toward a moment of decision. Miguel handed a small card to Damon, a number for a direct line at corporate that staff were instructed to use in emergencies. The gesture was quiet and ordinary, but it meant someone had thought of procedure in the middle of the chaos. Damon accepted the card with a nod and placed it carefully in his wallet. Christina, who had wanted to be the person who kept things orderly, found herself suddenly small in a room that had expanded into a public square. Her badge at her chest seemed, in that moment, like a little brass target. She had written her confidence into an identity that now came under scrutiny. She did not yet know what the scrutiny would reveal. She only knew that her authority had been contested. Outside, the live stream was now being watched by people who would later describe the moment as a flashpoint. A manager's finger, a man who refused to be humiliated, a security guard who hesitated, a sales associate who was punished for speaking up, an elderly judge who recorded. The pattern created a narrative that did not stop at the boutique door. It asked the company to answer more than one question. In a cramped PR office at Meridian's headquarters, the executive team gathered around a monitor and watched the footage. The room smelled faintly of coffee and the sterile assurance of brand guidelines. James sat with his hands folded, not yet speaking, while his team reviewed internal files that might offer context. Previous complaints flagged as protocol deviations. A few incident reports in the last 2 years. Nothing conclusive, nothing neatly damning. Just small entries that, when strung together, started to suggest a pattern to someone looking for it. He thought of what accountability could look like when enacted quickly and cleanly. He thought of the company's values plastered in brochures, words about inclusion and service that sometimes feel like advertising, but can also be a scaffold for change. He had been a businessman long enough to know that brands are both what you sell and what you protect. but he had also reached an age where a company's moral choices began to matter personally. He understood who would be held to account if Meridian failed to respond. On the sidewalk outside the store, a reporter adjusted his microphone and thought about headlines. Would this be a story about corporate failure? About retail staff making poor choices? About a black man who had certainly been humiliated? The clip provided multiple threads. The threads could be woven into a tapestry of institutional critique or into a portrait of an individual manager's lapse. The pattern the public chose to notice would be shaped not only by what had occurred, but by how an institution chose to respond. Inside the boutique, a low, insistent vibration ran through the crowd of phones as the clip migrated. The moment had become temporal currency. People who had been shoppers 10 minutes earlier now took positions in an unfolding public narrative. The staff waiting for corporate to arrive looked at each other in the hollow way of people who had been made suddenly aware of policy, both as tool and as weapon. Damon stood with the faces of the witnesses around him as if they were a constellation he had to map. He had always believed that power is a responsibility. He had not come to Meridian that afternoon to make an example. He had come to shop. Yet the world had put him in a different role, a role that demanded he think both as a person and as someone who could mobilize resources for change. He spoke to Miguel and to Sarah in low tones, not to sway them but to thank them. "You did the right thing," he said to Miguel. "You stood up." To Sarah he said, "You spoke truth. We'll make sure your voice is heard." Sarah's eyes were bright with unshed tears, equal parts relief and fear. She had been punished for defending what should have been obvious, and was now, in the messy meeting of public attention, a symbol of the human cost of upholding dignity. The cameras outside prodded like nervous animals. Someone shouted a question that felt like it was meant to be a guillotine. "Will you apologize?" Christina's mouth shaped a response, but before she could speak, a noise from the street drew everyone's attention. At corporate, James Richardson stood from his desk. He slid his phone into his pocket. He picked up his coat. The movement was the hinge the whole afternoon pivoted on. He did not yet know how he would speak. He only knew that staying in his office while a customer's dignity was publicly shredded was not an answer. As he left, someone in the office asked quietly, "What do you want us to do?" James paused on the stairs and looked down the corridor lined with framed pictures of Meridian's founders and quiet galleries of past holiday campaigns. He said quietly, as if repeating something that should be obvious, "Get me all the footage, pull personnel records, bring me HR, and tell security to hold any actions until I get there." His assistant blinked. "Do you want me to call the press?" "Not yet," James said, and there was a deliberateness to it that suggested he preferred action over statement. "We need to see what happened first." On the corner, Tiffany's stream hit a new plateau. Her phone buzzed with messages from people who wanted to know how they could help. Mrs. Davidson's recording, steady and legalistic, became a kind of cross-check to the excited chatter of the live feed. Miguel's hand on the counter was an anchor for people who feared escalation. Damon kept his hands folded. Christina wrapped her arms around a narrative she had built of protection and then felt the ground shift beneath. This was where a story like this stops being only about an accusation and becomes something larger. A test of what an institution will do when its procedures have harmed a person. The camera phones kept clicking. The world outside braced to see whether corporate power would be used to repair or to paper over. The convoy at corporate's lot cooled its engines. Someone opened a trunk and placed an extra suit inside as if preparing for a public confrontation rather than a meeting. James's driver asked the routine question, "Which car?" And James chose, not the town car, but a quiet one that rode low to the road. He wanted to arrive without spectacle, though he could not help but know the optics before him. He had read the feeds, seen the numbers, felt the pressure of a brand being judged in real time. Inside Meridian's flagship, the phones kept humming. The little green number of Tiffany's stream had moved from hundreds to thousands. Comments rolled in with the steady insistence of a tide. "This is wrong. He's clearly a customer. That badge is power misused." In the boutique, the moment was not yet resolved. It had only been accelerated. And then, as the car slid out of the corporate lot and the city seemed to draw a collective breath, The car slid out of the lot and the city seemed to inhale at once. If the boutique's afternoon had been an island of heat, the road that led to it now carried the current. A quiet, dark sedan, a pressed suit, a man who had just watched a video that made him get up. When James Richardson stepped from the vehicle and walked toward Meridian's flagship, the crowd outside sensed the arrival of corporate authority, the way a plainclothes officer signals a change in tempo. Sudden attention, the click that says someone important had decided to look. Before he reached the glass doors, James had already replayed the clip on his phone twice. He knew what he would find when the video was viewed at resolution. A manager's finger, a patient man, a fired associate, the steady hum of witness phones. He did not rehearse words on the way in. The footage suggested a course of action that would have to be decisive and immediate. He thought about brand and shareholders, yes, but he thought just as sharply about what a company owed the people it served and employed when its policies became a weapon. Pushing through the boutique doors, he walked with the plain authority of someone who had decided to be present rather than delegate. The chandeliers made the room look like a tuna of gold. The customers who had drifted to the windows turned toward the new figure. Staff stiffened with that reflexive awareness that leaders often carry, part protection, part dread. Christina Hayes looked toward the entrance, then away, as if the movement of her life had been interrupted by a wind she did not understand. James moved straight to the counter where the small theater of accusation had played out. He did not linger on greeting ritual. He met Damon Wells's eyes and with a short professional inflection that cut through the murmurs said, "Mr. Wells?" The name landed like a marker in the air. Some in the room flinched. For a moment the boutique felt smaller, as if everyone had been gathered into an instant not of spectacle, but of recognition. Damon nodded once. He had anticipated this possibility when he made the call. He had put the corporate line in his wallet with the intention of making the company answer. He had not asked for a personal visit. He had not expected the CEO to step into the shop himself. He kept his posture measured, he kept his voice low. "James Richardson," the CEO said, and introduced himself to the room in a way that read less like an announcement than like a clearing of air. He turned his attention to Christina. "Can you walk me through what happened here?" Christina, who had been rehearsing the certainty of her rules in her head, now felt something keener. The gaze of an institution upon her. She answered quickly, the cadence of someone who had trained her response until it sounded convincing even under stress. "We have protocols for verification. He couldn't—" "You asked a customer to prove himself," James finished simply, and the sentence held no dizziness of accusation, only the compressed clarity of a chief executive reading a failure in his operations. He asked to see the security footage on the store's monitor. When the frame filled with the clearest pixels, a timestamp flashing 3:14 p.m., the room watched itself from above, an objective replay that complicated every private feeling. Cameras don't care for context. They record the fact that a finger found a chest and that a manager pointed while a man stood still. The image showed Miguel stepping forward with his hand out. It showed Sarah rushing to speak and then being told to step back. It showed Christina's chin up when she gave the order to suspend. James watched each millisecond once, then again. He had seen enough of the clip on his phone to know the pattern. In person, watching the footage on the shop's larger monitor, the details mapped together into a clearer picture. Tone, gesture, sequence. He reached for the store's personnel file on the laptop that HR had opened to the incident report and scrolled. There were entries, complaints, flagged notes, annotations. Not a mountain of evidence, James thought, but enough to make a line between isolated acts and a pattern if that line were pulled taut. A personnel record listed a previous incident, a formal warning last year for overzealous application of protocol, a phrase that bureaucracies use when they want to criticize without naming the harm. Another note mentioned customer feedback that had been characterized as attitude. 2 minor write-ups, a coaching session flagged as complete. Taken alone, each entry could be rationalized. Taken together, they suggested a manager whose method bent toward suspicion. James asked for witnesses. Miguel stepped forward first, hands folded, a uniformed presence that never shouted, but always suggested care with its weight. He recounted his choice with the modesty of someone who had practiced restraint. "We trained to de-escalate," he said. "I moved to keep things calm. Mr. Wells didn't resist. He showed his card. I didn't see the threat. I only saw a customer. Sarah's voice was softer when she spoke, but steadier than the afternoon had made her feel. I told Christina Mr. Wells shops here. I told her he came to our previews. She said I wasn't authorized to speak and suspended me on the spot. Her words landed plain and human. She described how she'd watched customers, how she'd tried to use the store's VIP registry to prove a point in private, and how the manager had refused to pause. It felt like she needed a villain, Sarah said. She made one. Mrs. Eleanor Davidson provided her statement next, a clipped, precise account that read like a transcript of what she had recorded in real time. I recorded the incident because I believed it would matter, she said. You can have the file. The judge's voice had that quality of evidence-driven neutrality. She did not offer moralizing commentary, only the fact that she had recorded the event and the time marking when she had done so. Her presence, James realized, breathed an extra order of seriousness into the situation. An elder jurist does not simply witness, she anchors the record. Tiffany Washington, on the corner with a phone whose screen had become a small electric window, was ushered inside and asked if she would share her footage. She handed her phone to a member of PR who asked for permission to archive the live stream. Tiffany said yes. Her stream, initially a neighborhood curiosity, now functioned as a source file for the staff assembling the company's response. James listened to each voice and watched the footage again. He thought about harm, how it smells in a retail environment where service is the product. He thought about the company's stated values on the wall of the conference room. Respect, inclusion, excellence. If a manager's checklist could effectively exclude customers, what did that say about the scaffolding that supported that checklist? He turned to Christina and asked plainly, "Have there been prior complaints about your conduct, formal or informal?" She answered, "There have been coaching notes. We address behavior with coaching." Her tone attempted to hold the language of policy as shield. James could hear that she wanted the catalog of procedural words to perform righteousness. But protocols are human-made. Instruments of order are interpreted by human hands. The question was whether interpretation had become a tool of exclusion. A senior HR executive, who had been reviewing personnel files in a room down the corridor, presented a tidy timeline. 3 internal notes over 2 years that referenced discretionary enforcement of loss prevention protocols, 1 customer feedback report that had been logged and filed, a performance improvement plan completed and closed. The file did not shout, but when James looked at it with the video, the combination suggested a manager whose approach had repeatedly edged toward suspicion. He had the authority to make internal decisions, but he wanted first to see if the company's own systems had failed the very people they were meant to protect. He called a short meeting in the boutique back room, private but not secret, and asked for recommendations. The legal counsel spoke in practical terms. We need documented steps. We need to preserve footage. We should interview witnesses and have HR collect statements. We should consider disciplinary action if policies were misapplied. James nodded and then said something that surprised more than a few in the room by its simplicity. We should listen to Damon on what he wants. We should also look at the store's policies and see where procedure became prejudice. He asked Damon what he wanted. Damon answered with the same calm he had shown at the counter. I don't want a headline apology, he said. I want policies changed so this doesn't happen to someone else. I want staff trained to recognize bias, and a real system for appeals that doesn't funnel complaints back through a manager who may be part of the problem. And I want the people who stood up for dignity, Miguel and Sarah, protected. James took notes as if they were the minutes of a board meeting. They were, in a sense. We will start an immediate independent review, he said. We will put Christina on administrative leave while HR completes the investigation. We will hold off on any action that looks like cover-up, and we will make changes if we find a systemic issue. When he said the words, the boutique exhaled. The decision to put a manager on administrative leave was administrative, yes, but also symbolic. An institution had stepped in to prevent an individual scapegoat from falling without examination of the scaffold that supported her. Word of James's presence and his decision to pause actions traveled quickly. Tiffany's livestream updated with the image of a plain-suited executive in conversation with Damon. Comments poured in, supportive and skeptical in equal measure. Finally, one viewer typed, "Now he's here," wrote another, and a third asked, "Will she be fired?" The comment threads are a crude measure of human desire for clear justice. They demand headlines before the work of accountability is even done. At headquarters that evening, the company's legal and PR teams began to assemble the sequence of actions that would become the company's public response. They archived the different clips, gathered witness statements, and wrote an internal memorandum to the board that described the incident, the personnel records they had found, and recommended disciplinary measures. James pushed for an audit of the store's loss prevention training and a wider review across the chain. He insisted that any remedial measures be clear, measurable, and public. He also understood optics. A CEO can make pronouncements that soothe public sentiment while offering no structural change. He did not want that. He convened a panel of external consultants, a retail inclusion specialist, a civil rights compliance advisor, and an HR process auditor to ensure the review would not be written solely by people inside Meridian's existing culture. He wanted assessments that would be transparent and not merely a polishing of the brand's surface. Meanwhile, the public narrative picked up a new beat. People wanted to know who Damon Wells was. The name had a resonance. He was not anonymous. In the corridors of media and social feeds, his biography moved from description into identity. A longtime patron of Meridian, a businessman with philanthropic credentials, someone who had the means and the inclination to insist on structural remedies. The narrative of a powerful man being humiliated had an extra twist when the man was actually an owner. The dynamic shifted from simple humiliation into a test of corporate allegiance. But even with Damon's profile and James's intervention, the matter did not disappear into the tidy world of PR. Evidence had to be gathered and decisions had to be fair. If the company was to act with integrity, it would have to explain not simply that a manager had behaved badly, but how the management processes allowed it to happen and what the company would do to prevent recurrence. HR completed an expedited investigation over the next 5 business days. Investigators interviewed staff, reviewed store logs, and examined the personnel file that contained the notes mentioning discretionary enforcement. That phrase, when read by an investigator who knew how bias takes shape, became a thread. It suggested a breathing space inside the rules where assumptions could flourish, where codes like Christina's "protect the floor" could be interpreted as license. During those interviews, a pattern emerged in the testimonies. Sales associates described being coached to watch for behaviors that felt off, a subjective rubric that used vague markers like loitering or not carrying a bag as risk indicators. Security training emphasized swift action rather than reflective assessment. Employees of color described the extra vigilance they felt from certain staff. These accounts, when collected and compared side by side with recorded incident reports, indicated more than a single bad judgment. They pointed to a culture where loss prevention practices could and did intersect with racial bias. James read the HR summary and then the transcribed witness statements. He weighed the company's reputation against a moral duty an institution owes to its customers and employees. For him, leadership was not a headline, but a practice of ankles-deep work, changing operational manuals, retraining teams, rewriting checklists so they became doors rather than weapons. He had a choice. Issue a statement that acknowledged the incident and then retreat, or take steps that would rearrange how the company operated. He chose the latter. Meridian announced, in a carefully worded release, that it would terminate the employment of the manager involved for cause, citing misapplication of store protocol and violation of the standards of customer treatment Meridian expects. The statement avoided language that ventured into moralizing. It reported the fact of termination and the reason as aligned with company policy. It also announced a series of measures: an independent audit of loss prevention training, mandatory bias awareness and de-escalation training for all retail staff, the creation of a third-party hotline to report incidents confidentially, and a review of the appeals process for customers who felt they had been mistreated. The press took the line in different ways. Some lauded the company's quick action. Others argued it was reactive, compelled by viral outrage. Social feeds traded hot takes. Within the store, staff processed the news in private conversations. Relief for some, grief for others. Christina's termination was real and sharp. She had, in an instant, lost the job that had been an axis of identity. The company maintained discretion in the public details, but the consequences for her life were not a point of celebration. People lost livelihoods, and Meridian's response included language about the dignity of all employees, even as it enforced consequences for misconduct. Miguel's role in the incident drew attention from the company in another way. James personally recommended him for a review that would expand his responsibilities. The company publicly commended his refusal to escalate and privately discussed a promotion into a supervisory role overseeing training for loss prevention officers, a role that would center de-escalation protocol instead of reflexive removal. Miguel accepted with a quiet pleasure that was less about title and more about the ability to shape how other guards would act when tested. Sarah's path was different, but marked by a similar arc of recognition. Her suspension had been reversed. HR invited her to participate in the store's new advisory board for employee experience, and within a few months, she was offered a formal role in customer advocacy and staff training, a position designed to give frontline employees a direct voice in how policies were implemented. Her promotion was both symbolic and practical. It acknowledged her courage in speaking up and gave her the tools to prevent similar harm from happening to others. These personnel changes were not intended as trophies. They were, instead, part of an institutional attempt to recalibrate authority and accountability. The company also codified new procedures. Any loss prevention escalation required a secondary verification step before security was summoned. Managers had to log the specific behaviors that triggered suspicion rather than rely on subjective impressions. Calls to corporate could be escalated to a neutral ombudsperson when a complaint involved a staff versus customer dispute. The PR team fashioned the company's public narrative to emphasize learning and reform rather than retribution. James released a video statement that did not dramatize the incident, but acknowledged weakness in the company's systems and promised steps to fix them. He invited community leaders and civil rights organizations to participate in the audit, choosing transparency over secrecy. The company committed to publishing a summary of the audit's findings and progress updates on policy implementation. On social media, responses splintered. Some declared the company accountable and praised the swift termination. Others said the reaction was driven by viral pressure, not principled leadership. The reality, as James and Damon understood, was messier. The company had acted under the glare of public attention, true, but it had also taken steps that required sustained attention beyond headlines. New training modules, a third-party hotline, and measurable tracking of complaints and resolutions. There were immediate financial reverberations. Meridian's stock dipped for a trading day as investors parsed the reputational risk and the cost of remediation. The market's reaction was a reminder that corporate conscience and fiscal calculus often move in unequal time. James accepted the short-term hit as the cost of restoring long-term trust. Over the months that followed, as the company published updates on training completion and policy reforms, public sentiment softened and then shifted. Consumers who had been wary of Meridian's brand returned when they saw sustained action rather than a one-off apology. What mattered most to Damon, however, was not stock or optics. He had framed his request around structural change, and he measured success not by headlines, but by whether the company had altered the mechanics that allowed his humiliation. He worked quietly with the independent consultants James had hired, advising on practical steps, how appeals should be logged and escalated, how training should include actual scenario-based exercises rather than checkbox modules, how the VIP registry should be used to serve customers rather than justify exclusion. He also insisted on humility from the brand, that the company report back in concrete terms on the audit's recommendations and its progress. "Don't make this a PR moment," he told James. "Make it a process." He was mindful of spectacle. He had seen before how sensationalism eats substance for breakfast. He wanted measurable change, not a dramatized apology. Over the next months, Meridian rolled out mandatory training in its U.S. stores on implicit bias, de-escalation, and customer rights. The training modules were not perfunctory. They included role-playing sessions in which staff practiced making verification decisions with real-time oversight and feedback. Meridian established the anonymous hotline and contracted with a third-party organization to manage it so complaints could be reviewed without the filter of local store management. The company also instituted quarterly public reporting on complaints and their resolutions, an unusual step for a retail brand, and one designed to signal an institutional commitment to transparency. The elections of policy and practice created discomfort in places. Some regional managers resisted the change initially, arguing about autonomy. But as the new protocols proved in actual moments, instances where an overzealous response was deflected by a mandatory secondary verification step, resistance softened. The changes did not cure prejudice overnight, nor did they eliminate error, but they changed the scaffolding in which human decisions were made. Christina's termination remained a painful subject across internal channels. Employees who knew her were conflicted. Some understood that her actions had caused harm, others saw only the rupture of a career. Meridian offered outplacement assistance and counseling to staff impacted by the upheaval, a practical measure meant to recognize human consequence while still enforcing standards. Publicly, the company reported that the audit had found areas of concern and promised concrete steps to address them. The language was bureaucratic by necessity, but the actions, mandatory retraining, changes to loss prevention protocols, the new hotline, and the elevation of frontline voices into policy committees, began to function as real constraints on discretionary harm. Tiffany's livestream had a second life. Her clip, once viral, became part of training materials that Meridian used internally, with permission, a small paradox of a moment of humiliation becoming a teaching instrument to prevent future humiliation. She gained a wider following, and she used the attention to spotlight local community organizations that helped monitor retail equity. Mrs. Davidson, for her part, received a note from the company's legal counsel thanking her for preserving an objective record. She replied, succinct and clear, that she had only done what she'd always done. Record the moment the truth mattered. As the immediate fury receded into a long day's work of policy implementation, the people at the center of the incident adjusted in different ways. Damon resumed his life in public and private, but with an added commitment to institutional reform. He increased his engagement in community partnerships related to retail equity and served as a quiet advisor to Meridian's newly formed Inclusion Council. Advice he gave, not as a man exercising power to punish, but as someone who wanted the systems he cared about to function justly. Miguel accepted his new role with an appetite for change. He designed training sessions that emphasized conversation over command, and he led shadow shifts where new loss prevention hires practiced de-escalation under observation. He knew that the roar of public attention would fade. He wanted the small, steady work of building habits that would last beyond any news cycle. Sarah's position on the advisory board became a platform. She crafted an employee-facing guide that outlined what to do when a customer was wrongly accused, including how to document concerns, where to escalate them outside the store's management, and how to support colleagues who found themselves punished for insisting on dignity. Her work gave store employees a voice in policy rather than the feeling of being lectured from above. 1 year after the incident, Meridian's flagship had new signage in the lobby that went beyond advertising seasonal lines. It posted the store's customer rights charter, a plain language document that described how customers could expect to be treated, how complaints would be handled, and what independent resources were available. The marble floor still reflected chandeliers, but the neighborhood of people inside looked more varied. Families who might once have felt watched now lingered longer. The store's staff included people who had been hired through referral networks with community organizations that worked on retail equity, an intentional push to broaden the perspectives represented behind the counters. The company released an annual update that cataloged the reforms, the hotline's existence, and the percentage of reported cases that had been independently reviewed, the rollout of training across stores, the appointment of an ombudsperson to ensure timely responses. The update avoided flashy numbers and instead focused on processes and stories, examples of disagreements that had been resolved through the new appeals channel, and instances where customers were compensated for errors not by hush settlements, but by public acknowledgement and corrective action. The community around Meridian noticed the difference. It was not instantaneous or perfect, but it was sustained. Local advocacy groups that had once criticized the company for complacency now showed cautious willingness to participate in its advisory council. The board of Meridian had expanded its membership to include voices with expertise in civil rights compliance. The change did not erase harm, but it made the institution less hospitable to the casual processes that had allowed discrimination to be repeated. For Christina Hayes, the consequences were severe. Termination from the company meant the end of a decade-long position. She had to reckon with employment gaps and the loss of a role that had structured her identity. The company offered her counseling and outplacement assistance, as it did with others who were displaced by the fallout. The story did not depict vindictive satisfaction in her firing. There was a measured recognition that accountability does not require cruelty. The company tried to manage her departure with dignity, even while enforcing the necessary consequences of her actions. Across the city, the incident became a case study in corporate accountability. It was cited in panels and webinars as an example of how institutions could respond to viral moments, how transparent audits and external consultations could shape reform, and how frontline employees deserve direct channels to voice concerns. Damon, who had been cast in some narratives as a vindicator, resisted playing the role of a shaming figure. He gave interviews that emphasized systems over individuals, saying, "We need to change how decisions are made, not only punish the person who made a bad decision." People remembered, too, the small human exchanges. Miguel standing with his hand open on the counter, Sarah's suspended badge lying like a bruise until it was restored, Mrs. Davidson's recorder humming in her palm, Tiffany's raw stream turned into a document of civic attention. Those images, not the headlines, were what did the majority of the moral work. 1 year on, Damon returned to the flagship for a modest event, a listening session with staff and community leaders. He did not stand behind a lectern and declaim. He sat at a round table with a dozen people and listened. He asked questions, learned what the empowered staff still needed, and committed to funding community-driven initiatives focused on retail fairness. He insisted the company build a small external advisory board to review incidents and policies, an insistence James accepted because he had learned that leadership sometimes meant ceding control in order to rebuild trust. The flagship's transformation was not a theatrical makeover, but it was real in ways that mattered. A layered set of procedures that forced slower, fairer decisions, a hotline that functioned as an actual check against local bias, training that asked employees to practice humility rather than to rely on instinct, and a culture that, while never perfect, leaned toward listening. In quieter moments, Damon reflected on what had happened that day: a manager's finger, a patient man's refusal to be humiliated, a live stream that made witnesses out of strangers. He thought about the way power can be used, not to punish, but to protect. He believed that having resources imposed a responsibility to shape institutions so they prevented harm, rather than merely respond to it. On the anniversary of the incident, he walked through the flagship and noticed small changes. An employee from a neighborhood advocacy group greeting customers, a poster by the entrance explaining the store's customer rights charter, a small plaque recognizing staff who had completed the inclusion training. He paused before the same counter where he had stood the year before and saw Miguel organizing de-escalation drills with new hires. He watched Sarah quietly help a nervous associate through a customer interaction, offering practical coaching rather than admonition. The atmosphere was not jubilant. No one celebrated a firing, but it was steadier, more intentional. The larger lesson stretched beyond Meridian. The story had been, in the end, about what happens when a private institution chooses to use its power in public-facing ways, to further exclusion, or to correct it. The title's pivot, the moment James Richardson stepped out and said Mr. Wells, had been dramatic, yes, and revealing of status. But the longer, less glamorous work that followed was what mattered for the many who lived on the margins of institutional decisions. The city continued to watch, as cities do. New incidents surfaced elsewhere, each a reminder that one company's reformation does not undo a social problem. Still, Meridian's public reckoning became one example, imperfect but available, of how a company could be pushed, by witnesses and by customers who would not remain silent, towards structural change. The question that lingered, and that Damon and others invited people to sit with, was not whether the celebrity of an incident accelerates justice, sometimes it does, but whether institutions will learn to act when no camera is rolling. Public outrage can force a hinge to swing. The harder work is ensuring the hinge is set in a frame that will hold for the next person who walks through the door. If you believe dignity matters, Like this video and subscribe for more stories that examine how accountability can become action. When the story was told in classrooms and boardrooms alike, it often began the same way. A manager's finger that decided someone's fate, a crowd of witnesses whose phones turned private shame into public record, and then the rare and consequential moment when the person being shamed had the means and the patience to demand more than an apology. It ended in Meridian's case with changes that were not complete, but were real. Staff promoted for their refusal to escalate, policies rewritten to require verification beyond instinct, and a company willing to publish its progress. Power, the story suggested, has a moral grammar. It can be turned toward exclusion, toward the little violences that accumulate in retail aisles and waiting rooms, or toward protection, toward building systems that make dignity routine instead of exceptional. Damon Wells had not sought a spectacle that day. He had sought a system that answered fairly. The celebrity of the moment created leverage. The company's choice after the cameras left its orbit determined whether that leverage turned into lasting reform. So when the next story like this breaks, and it will, because prejudice is stubborn and institutions are imperfect, watch who arrives and what they do. Watch whether the people with authority choose procedure over protection or protection over prejudice. Watch whether the witness's footage becomes evidence used to reform systems, or whether it becomes a moment that fades, leaving the structures intact. What will you do the next time you see someone being humiliated? Will you record and share? Will you speak up? Will you insist that institutions do more than apologize? Share this story if you think power should protect the vulnerable, and tell us in the comments one thing you'll do next time you see injustice in public.